Reba McEntire sold more than 75 million records. She won every award Nashville had to offer, built a television career, launched a clothing empire, and turned her name into something that stretched from Broadway to Hollywood and back again. Most people who reach that level spend their later years protecting the legend. Reba spent hers deciding it wasn't worth the protection anymore. At 70, she sat down with her memories, not the curated ones she'd offered in interviews for decades, but the real ones, the ones that carried names she'd swallowed for years behind rhinestone gowns and a smile that the whole world recognized. 5 men who cut her in ways no audience ever saw, a father who didn't believe in her, an executive who wanted her obedient, a husband who needed her small, a partner who walked away without warning, and a rival who mistook her grief for weakness. None of them broke her, but each one left a mark she's finally ready to show, because silence, she decided, had become its own kind of prison. Clark McIntyre was a 3-time world champion steer wrestler, born for the rodeo arena, admired in the small community of Chalky, Oklahoma, and absolutely certain that singing was no career for his daughter. Reba grew up on the Oklahoma plains, the daughter of a man whose word carried the weight of a patriarch's pride, and whose toughness carved itself into everyone around him. Her mother, Jacqueline, could hear something in her voice, something that set her apart even on long car rides to rodeo events, harmonizing with her siblings like it cost her nothing. Her father heard a distraction, and he said so. He told her singing wasn't a real job, and he told her more than once. When her ambition grew louder than his patience, he went further, telling her flatly that she didn't have the talent to make it, that she was chasing something foolish. For a girl raised to respect that voice above most others, those words didn't dissolve over time. They calcified. She enrolled at Southeastern Oklahoma State University, kept performing at rodeos and small gigs, and carried her father's doubt like a stone in her pocket, something she reached for every time she needed to remember exactly why she had to prove herself to the world. The moment that changed her trajectory came in 1974 at the National Finals Rodeo in Oklahoma City, where she sang the national anthem and caught the attention of country singer Red Seagull. The gate opened. The path into country music appeared. But the wound her father had left never fully closed, because years later she admitted that no fan, no critic, no chart position ever pushed her harder than his disbelief had. She hated needing his approval. She hated more deeply that she never quite stopped wanting it. Nashville in the mid-1970s was not a place that rolled out a welcome mat for young women from Oklahoma with opinions about their own music. Reba signed her first record deal in 1975 and walked straight into a system built to file her down to a manageable size. Executives decided what songs she sang, how she dressed, how she moved, what image she presented to an audience. One man in particular, a gatekeeper whose name she rarely utters, made it his business to keep her in the lane he'd drawn for her. Safe material, predictable sound, nothing that matched the actual voice she carried. He made it plain she was replaceable, just another small-town girl who could be swapped out the moment she pushed back too hard. For a while, she didn't push back. She was young, she was learning, and the contracts kept her in a box she hadn't yet figured out how to escape. But that quiet period was storing pressure rather than releasing it. And when My Kind of Country dropped in 1984, everything stored came out at once. That album wasn't just a commercial breakthrough. It was a direct declaration aimed at every man who'd told her to stay in her lane. Platinum records followed. Sold-out tours followed. And the executive who'd treated her like a pawn watched from whatever distance he'd retreated to as she took creative control of her career in a way female country artists almost never had before her. She never forgot his face or his dismissals. In her private accounting of people who shaped her, he sat permanently in the column marked as the embodiment of arrogance. Charlie Battles came into her life looking like something familiar, a rodeo man, a steer wrestler more than a decade older than her, someone who seemed to speak the same language she'd grown up with in Chalky. They married in 1976, and what followed over the next 11 years was a master class in how love curdles when one person's success outpaces everything the other person can emotionally afford to accept. As Reba's career exploded through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, winning Female Vocalist of the Year at the CMAs, selling out venues night after night, becoming the face of a new generation of country music, Charlie's resentment grew in direct proportion to her rising profile. He wanted her home. He wanted her energy directed at him, rather than at audiences of thousands who adored her. When she traveled, arguments waited on the other end. He mocked her ambitions, dismissed her dreams, and reminded her sometimes quietly and sometimes not that no matter how large her name became, she still belonged to him first. She stayed longer than she should have, because loyalty ran deep in her upbringing, and because she'd been raised in a world where you didn't walk away from vows easily. But in 1987, after 11 years, she filed for divorce. She hated not just what he'd become, but how long she'd allowed herself to stay. Freedom, when it finally arrived, felt like breathing again, and it came packaged with the hard-won understanding that the next man in her life would have to be built differently. Narvel Blackstock seemed to be that different man. He managed her career, believed fully in her talent, and helped steer her from arena tours into television stardom, with a partnership that looked, from the outside, like the rare version of love that actually functions. For 26 years, they built something together. A life, a business, a shared story that the public watched with a kind of admiration. When their marriage ended in 2015, it didn't end with a long negotiation or a gradual fade into distance. Narvel had moved on with someone else almost immediately, and Reba described the split as a shock she never saw coming, a blindside delivered by the hand she'd held the longest. People close to her said it shattered her in ways she kept mostly private. The man who'd stood beside her through the hardest chapter of her life, who'd been present when she rebuilt herself from the most devastating grief she'd ever carried, had left without the warning she felt she deserved after more than 2 decades. That kind of betrayal carries a different weight than a power trip from an industry executive or a jealous husband's resentment. It reaches into the part of you that thought it understood someone completely and proves that understanding wrong in the most painful way available. Money reveals character, and in the 1990s, when Reba had become not just a singer, but a full brand with records selling millions and tours grossing millions more, a business associate she trusted chose to reveal his. He'd been siphoning money, cutting corners on her behalf, and using her name for his own gain while standing in front of her with reassurances that her empire was secure. She'd ignored whispers about him from others in the industry because she believed in him, and that loyalty made the eventual truth cut twice as deep. She admitted later that being deceived in business felt worse in certain ways than romantic betrayal, because love carries a risk that everyone enters knowing, but business is supposed to run on clarity and honesty. To be robbed by someone she'd actively defended left her humiliated in a way that had nothing to do with the amount stolen. From that point forward, she ran every aspect of her empire with both hands on every lever, scrutinizing contracts, overseeing deals personally, and building a reputation as a businesswoman who could not be handled. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Reba held country music in a grip that nobody could seriously dispute. Her presence at the CMA Awards had stopped being a surprise and become an expectation. And living somewhere inside that level of success was a rival, a fellow singer respected in his own right, who found watching her dominance more than he could tolerate without letting bitterness do the talking. To her face, he smiled the way that city taught everyone to smile. Behind her back, he dismissed her artistry as clever marketing rather than genuine talent, whispered to reporters, and spread the quiet kind of poison that Nashville's back corridors were specifically designed to carry. She heard the rumors. She always heard. And she hated the duplicity of it, hated that he wielded her gender like a standing argument against her legitimacy, hated most of all that he waited for her darkest moment to press hardest. March 16th, 1991, divided her life into a before and an after that no amount of music has ever fully bridged. 2 private jets carrying members of her band departed from San Diego after a concert, bound for the next stop on her tour. Reba and Narvel had stayed behind that night, planning to fly out later. Minutes after takeoff, one of the planes went down into the side of Otay Mountain. 7 members of her band and her tour manager were gone. She cried, by her own account, until her body had nothing remaining. She wondered out loud whether her will to sing had died on that mountain alongside them. What emerged from that darkness was For My Broken Heart, released in 1991, an album that carried grief in every note and became one of the most critically celebrated works of her entire career. Every lyric held the weight of survival, every melody the specific ache of people loved and lost without warning. And the rival who'd spent years quietly undermining her decided that the crash was a reasonable moment to question publicly whether she could continue performing at the same level without the team that had helped build her sound. That decision locked his place on her list permanently. Not because competition is wrong, but because only a particular kind of person uses someone's tragedy as material for their own advantage. She answered him the way she'd always answered every man who'd underestimated her. With longevity, they couldn't match, and music they couldn't touch. At 70, Reba McEntire stands on the far side of all of it. A father's doubt etched into her earliest memories, an executive's arrogance dressed up as industry wisdom, a husband's jealousy wearing the mask of love, a partner's abandonment arriving after 26 years without the grace of a warning, a rival's cruelty finding its moment in her greatest grief. 5 men whose betrayals she carried through platinum albums and sold-out arenas, through a television sitcom and a clothing line, through tragedy and recovery and decades of work that outlasted every single one of them. She named them not for revenge, not for attention, but because truth, when you've held it long enough, stops feeling like a weapon and starts feeling like the only thing left worth carrying. The queen of country music didn't build her legacy despite these men. She built it straight through them, note by note, album by album, year after defiant year. And at 70, she isn't bitter. She's finished.